The chandeliers in the Westin Ballroom cast a warm amber over polished glass and silver, and the quartet at the far wall drifted through a soft waltz, while servers floated past with trays of sparkling water and bite-sized crab cakes. I stepped in quietly, a simple black dress, low heels, the silver bracelet my mother left me resting cool against my wrist. It was April in Austin, mild air clinging to the revolving door as its side closed behind me. The banner read, "Women in Wealth," in serif gold, and the crowd swelled around the check-in table like a tide that had learned its steps years ago. Margaret saw me before I saw her. She was radiant in a jeweled navy gown, her smile meticulously bright, her confidence the kind that borrows a room and calls it home. She lifted a hand to summon me as if I were a late server, then turned toward a half-circle of donors and local executives. "This is my sister, Eleanor," she announced, voice pitched for a microphone that was not there. "She is between jobs. Her ex-husband left a nice settlement, so she is comfortable." Laughter sparkled at the edges like broken glass. I felt my ribs tighten, not with panic, but with the old muscle memory of being diminished at family tables. Under the chandelier, the light found every polished surface and missed me on purpose, and still I stood straight and let the moment pass over me. A woman in a coral dress leaned in with a sympathetic tilt, the kind of kindness that cuts. "Still living off that $75,000 divorce check, huh?" I searched her face for malice and found only gossip. The quartet reached a delicate cadence. I smiled. My voice would not be needed yet. I moved to the donation desk and set my clutch down. The attendant lifted her head with a professional smile that softened when she met my eyes. "I would like to make a contribution," I said. "Please note it as anonymous." She nodded, fingers ready above the keyboard. "Amount, $50,000, I said. She did not blink, though I watched her pupils widen a fraction. I presented my card. The matte black surface caught the chandelier glow. Wade Consulting Group was embossed near the chip in clean letters, and I saw the attendant register the name, then flick a glance at me, then back to the screen as if secrecy were a muscle she had trained. "Thank you, Miss Wade," she said softly. "Enjoy the evening." Behind me, Margaret laughed again, that effortless social sound that can bruise if you are standing too close. "Charity suits her," she said to no one, and to everyone. She has always been the needy one. The words reached me the way a thin, cold draft finds the back of a neck. My mother had said once that some sentences are weather, and you do not argue with weather, you endure it. I exhaled and turned. Margaret was arranging a tableau of smiles by the step, and Repeat Wallace sponsor to her left, a city councilwoman to her right, a photographer raising his camera. She saw me watching and gave me the smallest shrug, a sisterly gesture dressed as mercy. I let my gaze travel beyond her to the scrolling screens that listed donors and honorees in neat columns. Names rose and slipped like fish in a current. I knew mine would not appear. I did not need it to. A man in a charcoal suit approached with 2 flutes of sparkling water. He recognized me from a panel 3 years ago and asked if I still consulted for regional banks. "Sometimes," I said, "mostly healthcare and fintech now." He nodded, asked after Austin traffic, gave a diplomatic groan, and drifted on. It felt almost comic, the contrast between the story being told about me within 10 feet and the life I carried inside my chest. But this was not the night for explanations. This was the night for observation and for something else that did not require sound. The program director tapped a spoon against a glass and invited everyone to the stage area. Margaret glided forward, gathering applause with practiced hands. She thanked sponsors, thanked the committee, thanked the city for a spirit of enterprise, then adopted a thoughtful tilt to her head that I recognized from childhood recitals and prize days. "Families are the training ground for resilience," she said, smiling at the room and then carefully at me. "Some people learn to stand on their own feet. Some people learn to ask for help and call it destiny." The audience offered a soft, appreciative murmur. I tasted metal at the back of my tongue and let my jaw unclench. The attendant from the donation desk had taken a position near the side drape. When our eyes met, she gave a tiny nod that no one else would see. I returned it and felt something in me settle. It was not relief, it was alignment. The quartet moved into an upbeat piece. Servers brought out small plates. Conversations re-knotted themselves. Margaret resumed her orbit, greeting a banker from San Antonio, a philanthropist from Lakeway, a founder whose startup had just cleared a seed round. She passed close enough that I could smell white lilies on her perfume. She did not look at me. I let the distance stand. I could have crossed it. I could have said a dozen true things. I could have smiled and asked about payroll, about vendor terms, about aging receivables, and the loan she had just renegotiated at an interest rate that made hope a fragile thing. I did not. Not yet. Instead, I stood with my sparkling water and listened to the room breathe. The screen scrolled, the music swelled. I thought of my mother, of her hands rolling pie dough on a formica counter, of the way she would press the scraps together and say there is always another shape. Margaret called what I did charity. I called it irony, and I had brought enough quiet for both of us. If you have ever been made small by someone who should have held you up, stay with me. You will understand what came next. Austin, Texas, 2011. The summer heat was the kind that pressed against windows and made the air hum. My father's funeral ended beneath a cloudless sky, the kind of brightness that feels cruel when you are burying something you love. Margaret stood beside the pastor, thanking guests, her voice crisp, her lipstick perfect. I stood near the folding chairs with my mother, who clutched the program as if paper could anchor her to what was left. The next week, Margaret handled everything. She sold our family home on Magnolia Drive for $420,000, telling everyone she was doing it to simplify Mother's life. When the wire cleared, she transferred $60,000 to my account with a note that read, "Your share." I did not ask where the rest went. I was 35, working as a junior accountant at Austin First Bank, making $54,000 a year, careful with receipts, quiet about ambition. Margaret had already decided I was the sentimental one. She called once that autumn, her voice tight with efficiency. "Finance isn't for women with feelings," she said, then laughed as if it were a compliment. I laughed too, because silence was easier than defense. In her world, detachment was proof of success. In mine, it was evidence of loss. By 2013, she had married a venture lawyer named Daniel, who introduced her at parties as the numbers brain of the Holloway family. She liked the way that sounded. I stayed single content to balance ledgers and take evening walks by Lady Bird Lake, listening to the hum of crickets mixing with distant traffic. My friends from the bank would ask why I never joined Margaret's firm, and I would answer honestly. We speak different dialects of ambition. She heard applause. I heard completion. One night in 2014, while sorting old emails, I found one from her written during our college years. The subject line was blank. The message said, "You never finish what you start." I stared at the sentence longer than it deserved. I had finished degrees, projects, relationships, grief itself. But she never noticed completion that did not announce itself. By 2015, my marriage had dissolved under the quiet weight of neglect. My ex-husband left me $75,000 in the settlement and a note that said, "You'll be fine." I was in the technical sense. I rented a small 2-bedroom apartment for $1,400 a month, kept the old Camry running with regular oil changes, and told myself peace was worth more than company. Margaret visited once that winter. She arrived in a leased Mercedes wearing a white wool coat that matched her manicure. She surveyed my living room as if appraising a property. Her eyes lingered on the thrift store bookshelf and the faint crack in the plaster near the ceiling. "You should come work with me," she said. "We could use your discipline." I asked what position she had in mind. "Something supportive," she replied, already glancing at her phone. That night, I watched her taillights disappear into the frost and felt the old ache of comparison settle in my chest. But comparison is only poison when you swallow it. I let it go. 2016 arrived like a test of patience. Margaret launched Holloway Financial from a co-working space downtown, wearing her ambition like armor. The local paper ran a profile calling her a self-made millionaire, though I knew the inheritance she never mentioned. She posted photos of ribbon cuttings and networking luncheons, every smile a declaration. I sent a brief congratulations by text. She replied with a heart emoji and silence. I stayed at the bank another year long enough to understand that stability can also be a trap. In December, I withdrew $60,000 from savings-registered Wade Consulting Group in Travis County and rented a small workspace above a coffee shop on East 5th. It smelled of espresso and old paint, and I loved it instantly. My first clients were 2 tech startups trying to manage cash flow without burning through angel investments. I worked late into the night learning as I went drinking black coffee that tasted of risk. There were no headlines, no press releases, no applause, just spreadsheets and a growing sense that I had finally begun something that belonged entirely to me. Margaret never asked about it. She was too busy curating her success. Her annual income crossed $700,000 by 2018, and she started giving talks about the power of independence. I attended one unannounced sitting in the back. She spoke well. She always had. When the moderator asked what inspired her, she smiled. My sister once told me she envied my drive. That's when I realized some people are dreamers and others are doers. The audience laughed. I did not. Afterward, I slipped out before she could see me. Outside, the night air carried the scent of rain on concrete. I stood beneath a streetlight and thought of our father's hands, how they shook when he signed the deed to that house she sold. Margaret built her image on control. I was learning that true control comes from not needing to be seen. By the end of that year, my consultancy had 6 clients and revenue nearing $100,000. Modest, yes, but honest. I paid off my credit card balance and sent my mother a check each month to cover her home nurse. She never asked where the money came from. She simply said she was proud. When I closed my laptop one night and looked at the city from my window, the skyline flickered like a pulse. I felt something unclench inside me. Success did not need witnesses. It only needed consistency. Margaret built her empire on applause. I built mine on silence. The first year of Wade Consulting began in the spare room of my small East Austin apartment, the one that looked out over an alley lined with blooming crepe myrtles. I used a secondhand desk, a 12-year-old laptop, and a printer that coughed every few pages. My seed money was $60,000 drawn from savings and a promise to myself that I would never again rely on someone else's permission to build something real. I spent the first month creating spreadsheets that mapped survival rather than growth balancing rent utilities and software subscriptions against the thin hope of revenue. My first 3 clients were local startups too small for major firms, but too chaotic to survive without guidance. One made fitness trackers for seniors, another designed bookkeeping software, and the third was a nonprofit trying to modernize donations. They paid modestly but on time. That year, I earned $92,000 in revenue, enough to pay taxes, refill my savings account, and still afford the occasional dinner that did not involve leftovers. I learned how to sell without boasting and how to decline without apology. Most nights, I worked until 2, the glow of my monitor mixing with the hum of the city beyond my window. I liked the solitude. It made every win deliberate. By 2018, I had moved operations into a shared office on Cesar Chavez Street, a narrow suite with peeling paint and a view of the river. I hired my first assistant, a recent graduate named Callie, who asked thoughtful questions and never missed deadlines. Together, we built processes, templates, and workflows that would later form the backbone of something larger. Clients began referring others. The spreadsheet that once held 3 rows now held 26. I bought a used Ford Fusion and repainted the office walls myself on a Sunday morning while the city slept. Growth was quiet, almost invisible, but measurable. 2019 brought challenges and opportunity. One of my early clients, a tech incubator, collapsed after an investor pulled funding. They owed me $20,000, which I never recovered. I considered taking legal action, but decided the lesson was worth more than the money. Cash flow management became an obsession. I tracked every invoice, every hour, every variable expense. By December, our revenue touched $680,000, and I reinvested most of it into software and staff. I still lived simply. My rent rose to $1,600, my grocery list barely changed, and my weekends were a rotation of laundry ledger reviews and long walks through Zilker Park, where I rehearsed presentations aloud. When the pandemic arrived in 2020, Margaret called to check on Mother and asked casually how I was holding up. She assumed my small operation would fold. It didn't. Remote consulting became demand, not novelty. Companies struggling to adapt turned to firms like mine. Within 6 months, we had doubled our client list. By the end of that year, revenue hit $3.4 million with a net profit of $600,000. I hired remote analysts, designers, and accountants. Our Zoom backgrounds varied, but our pace aligned. In a world that felt paused, Wade Consulting grew. I avoided interviews, turned down podcasts, and ignored every offer to feature our female-founded success story. I was not building a brand, I was building durability. 2021 was the year I began to feel distance between who I was and who Margaret thought I remained. She had expanded Holloway Financial into a glossy downtown suite, complete with marble lobby and motivational slogans printed in gold script. I visited once to drop off documents for Mother's estate. The first thing I saw on her office wall was a framed phrase that read, "Handouts kill ambition." It made me laugh quietly. She had spent years living off our father's estate and yet preached independence like scripture. I did not argue. I just noted the irony and left before she could ask too many questions. The following year solidified what I had been too careful to claim success. Revenue reached $12 million, net profit 2.7, a team of 37. Clients included regional hospitals, fintech startups, and nonprofits expanding nationwide. I learned to delegate, to trust, to breathe. Callie became operations director. We introduced profit sharing for staff. At the Christmas meeting, I told them growth mattered less than integrity. They clapped softly, uncertain if applause was appropriate. I smiled and said, "That's enough." Then came 2023. It felt like everything I had built in private suddenly reached a point of undeniable mass. Revenue hit $18.2 million, net profit 4.1, 42 employees, 3 offices, and a waiting list of clients. One Tuesday morning in April, my assistant forwarded an email marked Partnership Inquiry. The sender was Holloway Financial. It was addressed to E. Wade. The tone was polished, full of rehearsed confidence. They proposed a collaborative venture to offer integrated consulting services, citing mutual benefits and aligned missions. The irony made me laugh out loud. Margaret had no idea that the initials she saw belonged to me. I wrote back 2 sentences. "Thank you for reaching out. We're not taking new partners this quarter." Then I archived the thread. That evening, I visited Mother's house to drop off groceries. Margaret was there rearranging flowers in a crystal vase. She greeted me with that same perfect smile and asked about my little firm. I said we were doing fine. She nodded, already losing interest, and began talking about expansion plans and her upcoming keynote at a finance summit. Behind her on the wall, the gold letters still declared, "Handouts kill ambition." I wondered if she ever read her own slogans or only commissioned them for others to admire. In June, a startup from San Antonio called MedTech Solutions reached out for a consultation. They were developing AI-driven diagnostic tools and needed help structuring a $2.4 million investment round. The project was complex but promising. We met twice in person, once in a modest boardroom that smelled faintly of new carpet and determination. After reviewing their books, I agreed to take them on as a client. On July 15th, we signed the contract. The number on the page felt both ordinary and monumental. It was not the largest deal I had closed, but it marked something intangible legitimacy without validation. That night, I sat on my porch watching the Austin skyline pulse against a navy sky. I thought of Margaret somewhere across town, probably drafting another speech about independence, while unaware that the sister she once called dependent had built an empire out of discipline. For the first time, I did not feel the urge to prove anything. My life was evidence enough. For the first time, I didn't need to prove I belonged. The summer of 2023 felt slower than most years, a kind of heavy stillness that only appears when something unseen is ending. Mother's 80th birthday fell on a Sunday, the sky clear, the air hot enough to make the candles wilt before they were lit. Margaret hosted the party at her home in Barton Creek, a gated property filled with hydrangeas, mirrors, and quiet competition. I arrived early carrying a bouquet of lilies, Mother's favorite, and a small envelope in my purse. Margaret greeted me with air kisses and the familiar inspection that preceded every comment. She wore a white silk dress and the expression of someone rehearsed in admiration. I complimented the table arrangements. She smiled tightly. "Still running your little online projects?" she asked, voice light, almost amused. "Guess that covers gas money." Guests within earshot laughed politely. I felt their eyes flick toward me, waiting to see how I would respond. I smiled and said I'd do my best. Then I turned to help Mother with her shawl. It was easier that way. Margaret's power had always come from the reaction she provoked. I refused to supply it. When dessert was served, I handed Mother the envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000 made out to St. David's Hospital Foundation. She read the amount twice, her hands trembling slightly, and whispered that it was too much. I told her it was for the cardiac unit she had spent so many nights in. Margaret leaned over to peek, and her smile faltered for half a second. She covered it quickly with another laugh. "That's sweet," she said. "Mother always did love your sentimental gestures." Then she announced loudly to the room that Holloway Financial had just sponsored the same hospital's gala at the Platinum tier. I nodded and excused myself to the patio, where the air smelled faintly of rosemary and chlorine. Later, while clearing dishes, I overheard two guests complimenting Margaret's generosity. I stood in the kitchen doorway, invisible behind a vase of tulips, and realized how thoroughly she had mastered the art of narrative. Margaret never lied outright. She simply rearranged truth until it admired her. She told stories where she was always the benefactor, the savior, the one with the plan. I once envied her fluency. Now I only recognized its cost. The next morning, as I packed leftovers into containers for Mother, Margaret appeared holding her phone. "You know," she said, "some people think success is about money. For me, it's about legacy." I smiled. Then she added almost kindly, "It must be hard for you watching me run a real company." I said nothing. Silence remained my most fluent reply. 2 weeks later, while reviewing invoices at the office, Callie approached with an odd look. Someone from Holloway Financial's auditing department had called, asking for confirmation of my credentials. The tone she said was unusually probing. I brushed it off until the following day when I received an email from an old colleague at Austin First Bank, now freelancing as an accountant. He wrote, "Margaret Holloway requested a background report on your firm. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't surprising, just clarifying. Margaret's curiosity always disguised itself as concern. She had spent years convincing others that my life depended on her approval. Now she needed evidence that her myth was still true. I deleted the message, closed my laptop, and poured a glass of water. The surface rippled slightly as I set it down. For the first time in years, I felt something close to anger. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that focuses. That evening, I visited Mother. She was weaker now, her breath thin, her eyes still sharp. She asked if Margaret and I had made peace. I told her peace required mutual recognition, and Margaret was still talking to her reflection. Mother smiled, a tired but knowing expression. She reached for my hand and said, "You don't need to prove your worth. She'll see someday." I didn't know then that it would be the last message she ever gave me. She passed away quietly in her sleep a week later. Margaret organized the memorial with predictable efficiency, managing guests, flowers, and press releases. I delivered a short eulogy about patience, forgiveness, and how truth does not require witnesses. Margaret cried at the podium, perfectly composed, then reminded attendees that she and I would continue Mother's charitable legacy through our shared commitment to responsible finance. I said nothing. I simply looked at her and saw the same girl who once rewrote her report cards before showing them to our parents. Image was oxygen. She could not live without it. After the service, I returned to my office and stared at the whiteboard covered in numbers. Business remained steady, our pipeline strong, but something inside me shifted. Success without defense was no longer enough. There had to be equilibrium. I spent the next week reviewing opportunities for strategic investment, studying companies struggling with liquidity but rich in data. One name kept resurfacing: Holloway Financial. Their balance sheets, once enviable, were tightening. Short-term liabilities rising, client retention slipping, debt service ratios strained. The numbers told a story Margaret would never admit aloud. Pride was eating her from within. I considered letting the market finish its lesson. Then I remembered Mother's voice. "You don't need to prove your worth. She'll see someday." In September, a contact from a private equity firm reached out about a quiet opportunity. A limited partnership under Beacon Capital was forming, aimed at acquiring distressed mid-tier financial services companies in Texas. The fund required a minimum investment of $4.5 million. I reviewed the portfolio list. Holloway Financial appeared second, tagged as candidate pending evaluation. My pulse steadied. I met the fund manager, a discreet man named Charles Mendel, for lunch at a quiet bistro downtown. He presented documents, risk assessments, and projected returns. I signed within 48 hours. Through Beacon Capital, I acquired a controlling interest in the firm my sister had built on vanity and borrowed charm. The irony was surgical. She had spent decades constructing walls of hierarchy between us, and now every brick belonged to me. I told no one. Not Callie, not my accountant, not even the board. Silence had carried me this far. It would carry me through the rest. The first quarterly report arrived with my new designation clearly printed on the investor summary, principal owner. I folded the page neatly, placed it in a folder labeled Legacy, and set it on the shelf above my desk. Outside, the city glowed against a late autumn dusk. I thought of Margaret somewhere across town rehearsing another speech about ambition, unaware that the story she had been telling the world was about to change authors. By June of 2024, Austin felt hotter than memory allowed. The city buzzed with construction cranes and the low hum of ambition, but inside Holloway Financial, the air carried the faint scent of panic. Their offices occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, all light and illusion. Beneath the shine, numbers were unraveling. The firm's short-term liabilities had climbed to $1.8 million, a sum Margaret pretended was temporary. She told staff they were restructuring, that late payments from clients would soon be cleared. In truth, the cash reserves were gone, siphoned into lifestyle expenses and a series of poorly timed investments. Margaret's calendar remained full of lunches and speaking engagements because the performance of stability often bought more time than stability itself. But time was expiring. Creditors began calling. The whispers reached the Austin business circuit, quiet but sharp. I followed the reports through Beacon Capital's updates, each spreadsheet a kind of X-ray of her denial. The data confirmed what instinct already knew. Margaret's empire was cracking. On a Wednesday afternoon, Charles Mendel called. His tone was calm, professional, the same neutrality he carried at our first meeting. "Holloway Financial has approached us," he said. "They are exploring a majority sale to cover liquidity needs." I remember the exact phrasing because it was both polite and damning. He asked whether Beacon Capital should proceed with evaluation. I said yes. I did not hesitate. Margaret met Charles 3 days later in a conference room lined with abstract art and too much glass. She arrived in a tailored navy suit, her posture the same as always, regal and defensive. Charles presented the offer, Beacon Capital would purchase 51% of Holloway Financial for $5.6 million, assume existing debts, and retain her as CEO for a 12-month transition. He explained the structure clearly, his voice steady. Margaret listened, lips tight, fingers drumming lightly on the table. When he finished, she leaned back and smiled. "Only amateurs sell their equity," she said. "I'm no amateur." Charles nodded, unbothered, and closed the folder. The meeting ended politely. She refused the offer. That night, however, she called him back. Pride falters faster in private. Her tone was different, cautious, edged with fatigue. She asked whether the offer was still valid. He said it was. She said she needed 3 days to consider. In those 72 hours, 2 major clients, an insurance group, and a regional bank pulled contracts totaling nearly $800,000. News of missed payments spread. Employees whispered about layoffs. Her accountant advised her to act before the fiscal quarter closed. By Friday evening, she sent her acceptance. The purchase agreement was executed Monday morning. I was in my office at Wade Consulting when the final notice arrived from Beacon's legal department. The message was short: transaction complete, equity transfer recorded. Attached was the updated ownership chart. Beneath Beacon Capital's logo, my name appeared in small print, Eleanor Wade, Principal Partner. I stared at it for a long time. The moment felt less like victory and more like gravity. Years of dismissal of silence mistaken for weakness condensed into a single ledger line. I thought of Mother, of her quiet smile, and whispered, "She'll see someday." Margaret held a press conference 2 days later presenting the sale as a strategic partnership designed to expand Holloway Financial's national footprint. She spoke of innovation, shared vision, and sustainable growth. The local business journal quoted her confidently, "This investment positions us for the future." Watching the clip online, I recognized the tremor beneath her tone. The lighting caught the faint sheen of sweat at her temple. She was still performing, but the stage now belonged to me. That week, Charles forwarded internal communications from Holloway Financial outlining transition protocols. Margaret insisted on retaining creative control and client relationships, unaware that the purchase agreement granted Beacon Capital full oversight of financial operations. Within the first review, auditors identified irregularities in travel and entertainment expenses, totaling $80,000, including a Paris trip labeled business development. The findings were not scandalous, merely revealing. For someone obsessed with image exposure itself was the punishment. Charles called again late one evening. "She's convinced she found a savior," he said, almost amused. I smiled at the phrasing. Let her think that I replied. It costs nothing. Meanwhile, Wade Consulting continued its quiet ascent. MedTech's project exceeded projections, generating new referrals. Our offices expanded into a larger suite on East 6th. My employees remained unaware of the parallel story unfolding across town. To them, I was simply the CEO who valued calm efficiency. No one suspected that my signature had rewritten the hierarchy of an entire family. A week after the sale, Margaret invited a small circle of executives to her home to celebrate the new partnership. Photos from the event appeared on social media: crystal glasses, designer dresses, her hand resting on the shoulder of a junior analyst as if bestowing favor. The caption read, "Grateful for allies who believe in women-led finance." The irony was precise. Every ally in that picture now reported to Beacon Capital. Every decision she made required my approval. Still, I did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in seeing her stumble. What lingered instead was an almost clinical fascination with how denial can masquerade as confidence until the paperwork says otherwise. Margaret continued her routines, attending luncheons, posing for magazines, repeating mantras about resilience. I let her. The truth needed no announcement. It only needed time. 3 weeks later, I received a forwarded message from Beacon's compliance officer. Holloway Financial had requested authorization for a discretionary bonus program intended to retain executive talent. The proposal included Margaret's name. I reviewed the document, crossed out the line item, and sent back a single note: deferred until Q4 review. It was not vengeance, merely policy. On the surface, Austin's skyline shimmered with the same false calm as before. Beneath it, power had quietly changed hands. Margaret believed she had sold survival. In reality, she had sold control. On a humid Friday evening, I drove past her office tower, the glass reflecting sunset like liquid fire. Inside, lights flickered on floor by floor as employees prepared for another week of uncertainty. I parked for a moment, watching unseen. In the reflection, the building looked almost hollow. She thought she found a savior. She'd sold it to me. The first sign of collapse arrived quietly, buried in an email chain labeled Client Concerns. 3 major accounts together worth more than $2.3 million in annual revenue had decided not to renew their contracts with Holloway Financial. The wording was polite, full of gratitude and formality, but the message was unmistakable. They had lost confidence. Margaret called an emergency meeting that Monday morning. Her staff gathered around the long conference table, faces, tense eyes avoiding hers. She spoke for nearly 40 minutes about market fluctuations, temporary shifts, and the cyclical nature of business. Her voice was measured, but her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her glass of water. The illusion of control was cracking, and everyone could feel it. By the end of the meeting, she ordered a new marketing campaign to restore momentum. None of them realized the problem could not be rebranded. From my office at Wade Consulting, I received Beacon Capital's weekly summary. The figures were clinical, stripped of emotion. Cash flow down 22%. Client attrition rate doubled. Debt service coverage falling below threshold. The numbers were both diagnosis and verdict. I read them while sipping coffee, calm as ever. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just signs checks. 2 weeks later, the first audit report arrived. Beacon Capital's internal compliance team had reviewed Holloway Financial's expenses and flagged irregularities. Among them were $80,000 in personal charges, billed to company accounts, designer clothing, fine dining, a stay at a Paris hotel, classified as business development. I skimmed the pages, each line a small revelation. Margaret's life had become an exhibit of excess disguised as necessity. The report was delivered to her under standard procedure. The email came from Beacon Capital's compliance department, the name she recognized, but not the hand behind it. She opened it in her office late one afternoon, sunlight slanting across the desk. Callie, who now managed transitions between our two firms, later described her reaction. Margaret's expression froze halfway between disbelief and outrage. She called the auditors, immediately demanding clarification. The call was routed through layers of formalities until she was told the review had been authorized by the principal partner. She hung up before hearing the name. That evening, an internal email circulated among her staff intended for a small audience, but leaked within hours. She spent $12,000 on Paris business trip spa. The line traveled faster than rumor copied, whispered, and forwarded. By the next morning, it had reached nearly every inbox in the building. Margaret summoned her assistant, slammed her phone onto the desk, and demanded to know who was spreading lies. The assistant, young and terrified, said nothing. Margaret's voice carried through the glass walls, sharp and brittle. I heard about it later from Charles, who had been copied on the compliance correspondence. His tone was clinical as always. The audit revealed exactly what we expected, he said. She's unraveling. I thanked him and ended the call. There was no satisfaction in her humiliation, only confirmation that the system worked exactly as designed. The following week, another client withdrew. This time, it was a pension fund worth $700,000 in managed assets. Their statement cited internal instability. Margaret called every contact she knew, offering discounts, dinners, anything to salvage the relationship. It was too late. Trust once fractured rarely mends on demand. In mid-July, Beacon Capital initiated a second round of financial oversight. Margaret received a formal letter requesting additional documentation. It arrived by courier-stamped confidential, signed by E. Wade. She read it twice, unaware that the name represented not an accountant but her sister. She placed the envelope on her desk, eyes narrowing at the neat signature, then set it aside. To her, it was just another faceless bureaucrat tightening the ropes. To me, it was equilibrium. That same day, I took a late lunch alone at a small restaurant near the lake. The table by the window overlooked the water where the reflection of clouds shimmered against slow ripples. I ordered an $18 salad and a $40 glass of Chardonnay. The waiter asked if anyone would join me. I said no. The quiet suited me. My phone buzzed with notifications from Beacon's board, but I ignored them for a while. There was a rhythm to downfall that did not need supervision. Some lessons unfold best in silence. Across town, Margaret stood in her office watching employees file out. Several desks were empty now, their occupants let go under the pretense of restructuring. She had always believed leadership was about command, not humility. Now the silence of an empty floor pressed against her like consequence. Reports continued arriving at Beacon Capital, each more revealing than the last. Late vendor payments, deferred bonuses, a discrepancy in the tax filings. None of it criminal, all of it corrosive. I signed off on the findings one by one, my initials small and precise. The paperwork of justice often looks like accounting. Late one evening, I received a message from Charles. She's requesting a meeting with principal ownership to discuss restructuring terms. I typed my reply slowly. Approve the meeting. I'll attend. Then I closed my laptop and watched the city fade into night. The glass towers shimmered like false promises, beautiful from a distance, hollow up close. Margaret still believed she could negotiate her way back to stability. She had not yet realized that every negotiation required leverage, and she had none left. For her, the sale had been survival. For me, it was inheritance reclaimed. When the restaurant's lights dimmed for closing, I finished the last sip of wine and stood. The bill arrived handwritten elegant. I left a 20% tip and signed the receipt. On the line for signature, I paused before writing my name. In that small motion, I understood something essential. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it simply pays attention, writes clearly, and walks away. The Texas Businesswomen Awards took place at the Hyatt Regency, downtown, the kind of event where ambition wore perfume and applause came rehearsed. The ballroom shimmered with sequined gowns, silver tablecloths, and 1,000 shades of pretense. June heat pressed against the windows, but inside the air was cool and bright, perfectly conditioned for performance. I sat near the center table, a reserved seat marked E. Wade Consulting Group, purchased as part of a $3,000 VIP package. Margaret, of course, was the evening star. Her name filled the program booklet, her photo printed beside the words, Businesswoman of the Year. It was her favorite kind of night, an audience, a microphone, and no competing voices. I sipped my water and waited. The ceremony began with predictable speeches about empowerment and legacy. Each honoree thanked mentors, spouses, and God in polished order. Margaret's turn arrived near the end. She walked to the podium in a red gown that caught the light like fire, the crowd erupting in approval. She paused for effect, smiled, and began. Some people depend on handouts. She said, her tone poised and deliberate. Others create empires. The audience laughed softly, assuming it was just a clever line. I knew better. The phrase was a blade dressed as a proverb. She scanned the room, her eyes gliding over the tables until they reached mine. Her smile deepened, a private smirk delivered publicly. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. Then the screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a PowerPoint slide of her company's achievements, growth percentages, philanthropic donations, future projections. At the bottom of the slide, in small but clear letters, was a line few noticed at first: ownership structure. It appeared for 3 seconds before anyone reacted. Then whispers rippled through the room. Wade Consulting Group, 51% ownership. The sound changed instantly. It was like hearing glass shift before it shatters. Someone near the stage leaned toward another guest and whispered, Wade Consulting. That's her sister's company, isn't it? Heads turned. The host tried to continue clapping, but the rhythm faltered. Margaret froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the screen as if her mind could will the words away. The image lingered, caught by the spotlight, before the technician advanced to the next slide too late. The truth had already entered the room. Cameras captured everything. A live stream for the event's social page was still running, and within minutes, the chat exploded. Comments poured in. "The broke sister owns the empire. You can't script karma like this. This is better than reality TV." Margaret's face changed, shade by shade, red fading into pale disbelief. Her microphone picked up the tremor in her breath as she tried to recover. "That was a formatting error," she stammered lightly. "Our partners collaborate with many firms, but the screen didn't lie. The audience didn't either. Every executive in that room knew the language of ownership. Numbers were never accidents." The moderator stepped in, thanking Margaret for her inspiring words. The applause that followed was hesitant, polite, the sound of people pretending nothing had happened while their eyes said otherwise. From my seat, I watched the chaos bloom in silence. I hadn't planned for the exposure to unfold this way. The presentation file had been submitted by her own team for review. Beacon Capital's compliance department, efficient as always, had simply included the updated ownership information as standard protocol. Transparency was part of the brand. There was no malice-only procedure. Still, the effect was surgical. The woman who once lectured me about dependency now stood beneath a banner of my making. Across the ballroom, a reporter from the Austin Chronicle lifted her phone, recording Margaret's face as realization dawned. I could almost hear the headline forming. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and folded my hands. Around me, conversations began again, cautious and charged. A few glances met mine, curious, knowing, or simply unsure. I met each one with the same calm expression, the same quiet composure that had carried me through years of her condescension. My stillness became its own performance. The live stream continued for another 20 minutes before the feed was cut. By then, the clip had already spread online. Twitter reposts multiplied by the hour. A local business influencer shared the footage with the caption, "When family dynamics meet capitalism." Within 12 hours, the video reached 200,000 views. The comment section divided between shock and satisfaction. Strangers debated whether Margaret had known whether the sisters were rivals, whether the reveal was revenge or poetic justice. I read none of it. Truth needed no defense. I simply closed my laptop and went to bed. At the event, the aftermath played out in slow motion. Margaret finished her speech without once meeting my eyes. When the music resumed, she stepped down from the podium surrounded by people who spoke too softly to be kind. Her publicist whispered frantically, her assistant fumbled with her phone, and the photographer captured every fractured second. I rose from my chair, quietly adjusted my jacket, and made my way toward the exit. The air in the hallway was cooler, the noise distant. Behind me, the ballroom continued to hum the sound of reputation unraveling under chandeliers. I did not look back. As I crossed the lobby, a security guard nodded at me, unaware of who I was. That anonymity felt cleaner than applause. I stepped into the night air, the city's lights reflecting off the Colorado River below. My heels clicked softly against the marble. Inside the ballroom, Margaret remained frozen in conversations she couldn't control. Outside, I breathed freely. For years, she had defined my worth through omission, making silence my cage. Tonight, that same silence had become the loudest truth in the room. Would you have walked away or reminded them who built it all? A week after the gala, Austin's business pages ran the same headline in slight variations. $5.6 million buyout shocks finance scene. Sister-owned empire rewrites the rule book. When family meets fortune. Every photo of Margaret from that night looked the same. Eyes wide, smile, frozen posture, too straight to be calm. The city loved a scandal almost as much as it loved a success story. This one offered both. I spent that week away from the noise at my small property in Dripping Springs, west of Austin. The land stretched across 8 acres, quiet and sun-baked, with a single-story house painted white and trimmed with cedar. It was worth about $850,000 on paper, but to me it was beyond price. Here the only sounds were wind through live oaks and the hum of crickets after sunset. My office sat by the kitchen window overlooking a field where deer sometimes passed at dawn. I brewed coffee in a French press, fed the dog, and turned off every notification on my phone. For the first time in months, the silence felt earned. On the third morning, a letter arrived in a cream envelope with my name written in Margaret's sharp handwriting. No return address, no apology. Just 3 pages of anger. You humiliated me in front of everyone it began. I can't show my face in Austin. You could have stopped it. You wanted that moment. Her words came clipped, wounded, blaming. I read them twice, folded them neatly, and slid the letter into a drawer. There was nothing in it I didn't already know. The truth rarely flatters the person exposed by it. Later that afternoon, an email came from a former Holloway Financial employee. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." The message was short. "I don't know if you're aware, but she never paid our $2,000 bonuses from last quarter. We received deposits today from the new administration. Thank you for making that right." I stared at the screen, the sentence glowing against the quiet of my study. It wasn't revenge. It was repair. Meanwhile, in Austin, the fallout had begun. Beacon Capital's compliance department released a statement confirming irregular expenditures at Holloway Financial during the previous fiscal year. The figure, $80,000 in misclassified expenses, now looked modest beside the new revelations. Investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a preliminary review into financial misrepresentation and misuse of company funds. It was not criminal yet, but the headlines treated it like one. Margaret's name trended online for 3 consecutive days, each post dissecting the same question. How could someone so vocal about discipline lose control so completely? The board of directors met in emergency session that Friday. I joined by video call from Dripping Springs, my face reflected in the corner of the screen, while executives argued in real time. Margaret appeared briefly defensive and exhausted, her once perfect hair tied back in a careless knot. She spoke of loyalty, of misunderstanding, of optics. The words fell flat. The chairwoman cleared her throat and read the motion to remove her as CEO, effective immediately. The vote passed unanimously. Margaret's microphone stayed muted as they announced the transition. She sat still, eyes distant, then logged off without a word. The official record noted her departure as voluntary. Everyone in that meeting knew better. That evening, I stepped outside into the cooling air. The sunset had turned the fields, copper cicadas buzzing like distant applause. I thought of how easily power could mistake itself for permanence. Margaret had once said leadership was about image. She never understood that endurance required humility. The world she built on applause had collapsed the moment silence spoke louder. The next morning, local reporters camped outside Holloway Financial's building. Employees slipped in through side doors, heads down. A photo of Margaret leaving the office carrying 2 boxes appeared online by noon. The caption read, "Former CEO departs amid investigation." She looked smaller than I remembered, not just physically, but in presence, like the air had learned to move past her. I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. At Wade Consulting, our own operations moved forward smoothly. Clients called to congratulate me on the acquisition, though I deflected the praise. It was a strategic alignment, I said each time. Business, not personal. It was true, though perhaps not entirely. The line between those 2 worlds had blurred long ago, when family dinners became performances and love was measured by hierarchy. On Sunday evening, Charles called from his office in Houston. The SEC review will take months, he said. But the findings are clear. Misuse of funds, incomplete disclosures. Nothing we can't manage. The company will survive. She won't. His tone was matter of fact. "Do you want to issue a statement?" "No," I replied. "Let silence handle it." He laughed softly. "You really believe in quiet justice." It's the only kind that lasts, I said and ended the call. As night settled, I opened the drawer again and reread Margaret's letter. The ink had smudged slightly where her hand must have pressed too hard. I imagined her sitting at her desk, writing furiously, convincing herself that my calm was cruelty. She couldn't understand that restraint was not indifference. It was control. Around 10, rain began to fall slow and steady against the tin roof. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching droplets gather on the pane. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the hills. It reminded me of applause fading after a performance, loud at first, then distant, then gone. The next day, another email arrived, this one from a local journalist asking for comment on the investigation. I declined politely. The facts speak for themselves, I wrote. It was all they needed. Within hours, an editorial appeared online with the headline, "When Pride Meets Precision, The Fall of Holloway Financial." The article described Margaret's career as a lesson in unchecked ego. I closed the page halfway through. There was no need to read more. As July began, life in Dripping Springs returned to its rhythm. I worked mornings, tended the garden in the afternoons, and left my phone in another room. Peace, I realized, is not the absence of noise, but the ability to hear it without reacting. Margaret's empire had crumbled not from betrayal, but from gravity. The weight of her own choices pulled it down. Karma doesn't knock. It walks right in. By August, the heat in Austin had settled like a weight. The city shimmered under a white sun that seemed to bleach everything it touched. At Wade Consulting, the air conditioning hummed steadily, the only sound inside the glass tower where calm was currency. I had just finished a client call when my assistant appeared at the door, hesitant. "There's someone here asking for you," she said quietly. "She doesn't have an appointment." I knew before hearing the name. "Margaret Holloway," she added. My pen stopped mid-note. I told her to let her in. Margaret entered slowly, shoulders bent, under a weight that had nothing to do with temperature. She wore a beige blouse wrinkled from travel and a skirt that didn't match. The bag slung over her arm was frayed at the corners, and her once impeccable jewelry had been replaced by cheap gold plating that caught the light awkwardly. She looked smaller, not only in stature, but in presence, as though her voice had been pawned along with everything else. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us like a bridge we both knew was unsafe to cross. Finally, she said, "Please, Eleanor, I need work." Her voice cracked at the edges, raw and stripped of its usual polish. "I'll take $5,000 a month. Anything. I can handle compliance, client retention, whatever you need." She tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. I gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself into the chair opposite my desk, the same posture I'd seen her use when interviewing others back when authority was still hers. Now her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse. "I just need a chance to start over," she said softly. "You know how hard it is out there." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I replied. "I know exactly how hard it is out there." She looked up desperate. "You've always been the smart one," she said, a strange echo of childhood rivalry slipping through. Maybe I didn't say it enough. Maybe I didn't show it. But I admired what you built. You made it without shortcuts. Her words landed somewhere between confession and negotiation. "I can help you expand. I know people." I folded my hands on the desk and studied her. The woman who once boasted of independence now spoke in the language of dependency. It was not revenge, I felt. It was recognition. "You used to say money reveals character," I reminded her quietly. "You were right." She blinked, unsure if it was an insult or agreement. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. "You know how I was. Trying to sound clever. Everyone does it." I opened a drawer and took out my checkbook. Her eyes followed the motion, hopeful. "I'm not giving you a job, Margaret," I said evenly. Her shoulders sank. "Then why am I here?" she asked, her tone brittle. I tore a check from the book and placed it on the desk between us. "This isn't for you," I said. "It's for closure." She hesitated before picking it up. Her fingers traced the amount, $2,000. She frowned. "What's this supposed to mean?" It's the value of the piece I'm buying, I said. Take it. Use it however you want. But after today, there will be nothing left between us that involves money, power, or pity. For a long moment, she sat there staring at the paper as if it might rearrange itself into something she could live with. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her purse. You always did know how to make things final, she said quietly. There was no venom in it this time, only fatigue. You think I deserve all this? She asked suddenly. The headlines, the humiliation, the investigation. You think karma keeps score? I met her eyes. Karma doesn't keep score, I said. It just balances accounts. She laughed, then a sound without humor, dry and brittle. I guess mine finally came due. She stood adjusting her purse, her composure trying to reassemble itself from the fragments of pride that remained. You won, Eleanor, she said. Congratulations. I shook my head. There was never a competition, only consequences. She looked around the office at the shelves lined with files, the framed photo of my team, the city skyline reflected on the glass. Her gaze stopped at the wall behind me where the company logo shimmered in brushed silver Wade Consulting Group. The light from the window caught it perfectly scattering reflections across the room. It's beautiful, she said softly. You built all this. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She turned toward the door, then paused. You know, she said. Without looking back, I used to tell people you were fragile, sensitive, that you couldn't handle pressure. I waited. I think maybe I said that because I couldn't admit you were stronger than I ever was. Then she walked out. The door closed with a quiet click. I exhaled slowly, realizing only then that I had been holding my breath. Outside the glass walls, the late afternoon sun hit the building across the street, throwing streaks of light through my office. The reflection landed directly on the logo again, bright enough to make me squint. For a second, Margaret's silhouette passed through that light, her figure small and ghost-like fading as the elevator doors shut behind her. I sat for a while longer, the checkbook still open, the pen still resting on the desk. My assistant peeked in. Everything all right? She asked. I nodded. Yes, everything's where it should be. When she left, I leaned back in my chair and looked at the skyline, the city moving as it always had. Cars threading through traffic clouds, drifting slow and indifferent. Somewhere in that rhythm, Margaret was walking out into a world she had once ruled, now learning what it meant to start at zero. The light on the wall dimmed as the sun lowered, leaving only my reflection in the glass, calm and unflinching. Justice, I thought, is rarely loud. It just waits for the right light to show its face. By September, the noise had softened into analysis. The Austin Chronicle ran a long editorial under the headline, "The $5.6 million Lesson When Humility Wins." The piece framed the Holloway collapse as both a cautionary tale and a quiet victory. It described Wade Consulting Group as a discipline-built firm led by precision, not ego, and closed with a sentence that lingered in readers' minds. Some people build empires to be seen, others build them to endure. I read it once over coffee at my kitchen table in Dripping Springs, and then slid the paper aside. The words were kind, maybe too kind. What they didn't capture was that endurance comes at the cost of solitude. Success fills rooms but empties noise. I was fine with that. 2 weeks later, I finalized the charter for the Wade Women Fund. The endowment began with $200,000 from my own accounts established through a local community bank rather than a corporate sponsor. Its purpose was simple: to support women rebuilding their lives after divorce or financial abuse, women told they were finished before they began. The first board meeting took place in my office conference room with 5 attendees, all women whose stories resembled scars turned lessons. One of them, a retired accountant named Ruth, asked if I wanted to put my name on the scholarship certificates. I told her no. The point is not who gave it, I said. The point is that it exists. The press got wind of the fund quickly. A local radio host called it a poetic reversal, tying it back to the buyout and the family feud. Reporters wanted a quote. I declined every request except a letter I sent privately to the Chronicle. It contained a single sentence: justice is not payback. It is repair. They published it without comment. That was enough. Around that time, a handwritten envelope arrived on my desk. The handwriting was careful looping from someone unaccustomed to writing often. Inside was a single page. Dear Ms. Wade, my name is Laura. I'm 62 years old. I left my husband last spring after 38 years. I thought it was too late to start again until I read about your fund. You gave me courage to try. The words blurred as I read them, not from sadness, but from a recognition so sharp it felt physical. That letter stayed pinned to the board above my desk, a small anchor reminding me that repair multiplies quietly. Meanwhile, Margaret's name drifted through headlines in shorter, duller notes. The SEC investigation closed without charges, but confirmed misuse of corporate funds and improper disclosures. The firm she founded was now fully absorbed under the Beacon umbrella. She sold her West Austin home for $1.1 million, using the proceeds to settle personal debts. The real estate listing described it as sun-drenched modern and freshly renovated. The truth was simpler. It was a house emptied of illusions. She moved to Dallas to live with her daughter, a quieter life measured in rent checks and volunteer shifts. Occasionally, I heard updates through mutual acquaintances. She was teaching financial literacy workshops at a community college, working part-time for a nonprofit. There was dignity in that if she could see it. I hoped she did. In late October, Forbes reached out requesting an interview for their Women Who Lead feature. They wanted to discuss the acquisition of the fund and what they called a masterclass in strategic patience. I smiled reading that phrase. Strategic patience sounded cleaner than what it really was, restraint born from survival. I drafted a polite decline. Silence is the luxury I earned, I wrote. They printed that as the pull, quote anyway, framing it above a full-page portrait of me from a past speaking event. The irony made me laugh. In a world obsessed with commentary, quiet becomes a headline. That same week, I met with Ruth and the team to review our first funding applications. We approved 8 grants totaling $75,000. The recipients included a baker opening a home business, a nurse completing her master's degree, and a woman starting a bookkeeping service after leaving a controlling marriage. Each file carried a story of endurance disguised as ordinary life. As I signed the approvals, I thought of how Margaret once mocked me for small ambitions. There was nothing small about helping someone rebuild dignity. It was the most scalable work imaginable. One evening, I returned to the lake house for the weekend. The water level had dropped slightly after the summer drought, revealing rocks usually hidden beneath the surface. I sat on the deck with a blanket watching the light shift from gold to blue. My phone buzzed with a text from Callie, the Chronicle. Just called again, they want a follow-up story about you and the fund. I typed back, tell them I'm unavailable. Then I turned the phone off completely. The sound of quiet was worth more than exposure. Before bed, I opened my journal for the first time in months. I wrote a single line. Peace is not what follows, justice. It is what remains after it. Closing the book, I realized how much of life unfolds between moments of recognition. I wasn't the same woman who once sat at that family dinner table, swallowing humiliation. Nor was I the person who signed the buyout papers with steady hands and a heart full of calculation. I had become something slower, steadier, someone who no longer needed to win to feel whole. The next morning, I checked my mail. Another envelope waited, this one forwarded through the office. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a typed note on plain paper. You may not believe this, it read, but Margaret's class for women in transition has helped more than 50 attendees. She speaks about humility now, about learning the hard way. She never says your name, but everyone knows who she means. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it beside Laura's letter. There was a symmetry to it, one beginning, one aftermath. both proof that repair works in both directions. Later that day, I met Charles for lunch downtown. He handed me a copy of the firm's quarterly report showing growth up 12%. "You're trending in all the right directions," he said. "If you ever want to take it public, we can talk." I smiled. "Not yet," I said. "Some things are better kept in their natural size." He laughed, knowing that meant never. Driving back to Dripping Springs, the sun hung low over the hills, painting everything in soft amber. The world moved as it always did, indifferent but balanced. Margaret had found a quieter purpose. I had found mine. The rest was noise fading in the distance. October brought the kind of mornings that made silence feel alive. At Lake Travis, the water looked like liquid glass, pale silver beneath a faint blue haze. I sat on the deck wrapped in a shawl coffee steaming beside an open notebook. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dew. This had become my ritual since moving more of my work to the lake house. It was the only place where I could think without the noise of emails or the hum of ambition. The world still spun around deadlines and markets, but here time behaved differently. I opened the notebook and began to write a letter addressed to myself. In 2016, I wrote, I had $9,400 in credit card debt, an aging car, and a rented apartment that echoed when I spoke. I thought power meant proof. Today I have peace, and that's worth more than any empire. The pen moved easily, the ink spreading smooth and even. Outside, the first rays of sun stretched across the lake like veins of light. I paused, letting the page dry. The breeze stirred gently, flipping to an earlier section of the notebook where a loose page fluttered free. It was from years ago, Mother's handwriting, a note she had tucked into a box of my belongings when I left the bank job to start Wade Consulting. The ink had faded slightly, but her words still carried weight. Success is quiet until it's undeniable. I traced the line with my fingertip, the curve of each letter like a memory. She had understood before I did that stillness could be power. The world mistakes volume for certainty, but real certainty never needs to shout. I set the note back into the book, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The phone beside me buzzed once a text notification lighting the screen. I hesitated before picking it up. The name surprised me, Margaret. We hadn't spoken since her visit in August. The message was short. "You were never the needy one." I was. I read it twice. There was no preface, no explanation, no demand, just truth stripped bare. For a moment I saw her as we once were, two girls in matching Sunday dresses, fighting over who would sit by Mother in church. It had taken decades and ruin for her to say the words that mattered. I typed no reply. Some things were better left whole. The sun rose higher, scattering reflections across the lake. Boats moved slowly in the distance, their wakes dissolving into soft ripples. I thought about how easily lives drift apart, how long it takes to learn that forgiveness isn't approval, but release. Margaret's message didn't absolve what came before, but it completed the circle. The wound closed on its own terms. I closed the notebook and leaned back, watching the light shift across the water. Inside the house, the quiet tick of the clock marked the passing minutes. On the mantel sat the silver Parker pen Mother had given me for graduation. It had written every major decision of my life: contracts, letters, checks, and endings. I picked it up and turned it between my fingers. The engraving read simply, E.W. The initials looked sharper now, as if age had honed them. I carried it back outside to the edge of the dock. The water below was calm, mirroring the sky so perfectly that horizon and reflection were indistinguishable. I crouched down, the pen balanced on my palm. For everything this helped me write, I whispered thank you. Then I let it slip from my hand. The pen fell silently, cutting through the surface and vanishing beneath a shimmer of sunlight. Watching it sink, I felt no loss, only completion. The tool that had built my defense, my empire, and my closure could rest where words were no longer needed. The ripples widened and then disappeared, leaving only the steady surface. I stayed there until the light shifted gold. Later, as I packed up the notebook, I reread the last paragraph I'd written. Peace is not earned by victory. It's the reward for surviving long enough to understand your own worth. I closed the cover and tied the string around it. The act felt ceremonial, a quiet acknowledgement that the story had finished itself. Inside, I brewed another cup of coffee and turned on the radio. A local station mentioned the Wade Women Fund, now expanding into neighboring states. Ruth's voice came through calm and confident, describing how dozens of women had received their first grants. She ended the interview with a phrase that made me smile. "Our founder believes strength begins in silence." I turned the radio off after that, letting the sentence linger in the air. By afternoon, the lake house filled with light, the kind that softens edges and forgives dust. I opened the windows to let the breeze move through. The curtains fluttered like slow breaths. On the table sat 2 envelopes, Laura's handwritten thank you, and the anonymous note about Margaret's classes in Dallas. I placed them side by side in a small wooden box and locked it. The key joined the rest of my keepsakes in a glass jar near the window. I no longer needed reminders of closure, only symbols of continuity. As evening approached, the sky turned amber and then violet. The water mirrored every color. I poured a glass of wine and sat again on the deck, the same place where it had all begun, years ago when Wade Consulting was only a name scribbled on a napkin. I thought about the distance between then and now, not measured in money or milestones, but in quiet mornings where I no longer needed to defend my existence. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the lake like a benediction. Somewhere a heron lifted off its wings, slow and certain. I raised the glass slightly, not as a toast, but as recognition. Everything had balanced. As the sky darkened, I imagined Mother's voice soft and certain as ever. Success is quiet until it's undeniable. She had been right all along. The air cooled, carrying the scent of water and cedar. I whispered the words aloud, almost to myself. She thought I needed handouts. I only needed peace. The words floated into the stillness, dissolving like mist. Have you ever been called less by someone who should have known better? Tell me how you proved them wrong.